The Blasphemers by Philip Jose Farmer. Originally published in the April 1963 issue of Galaxy magazine, republished in a French version of Galaxy in November of the same year, and in the July 1965 issue of an Italian science fiction magazine called Urania. It appears in 3 collections of the author's own stories, the first of which was entitled Down in the Black Gang and Other Stories in May 1971 and was reissued in October of the same year with new cover art, the second of which was Prometheus in February 1977, and the third, called Up the Bright River from March 2011. Read by Daryl T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. The Blasphemers. 1. 12,000 ancestors looked down on him. Jagu stopped for a moment. Despite his skepticism, he could not help but being impressed and even a little guilty. 12,000! If there were such things as ghosts, what a might of phantoms was massed in this dark and holy chamber. How intense would be their assembled hatred, focused on him? He was on the ground floor of the castle and in the room of the Hero Fathers. 100 feet square, it was at this moment lit by a few electric flambeaux. A tremendous fireplace was at one end. In it, in the old days, the greatest enemy of the Wazaga, Zeiti of the Yoruba clan, had been burned alive after the Battle of Ta'alulu. Above the mantel were the trophies of that battle: swords, shields, lances, maces, and several flintlock blunderbusses. Beyond this room, deeper in the castle, was a room decorated with the accumulated trophies of 1,000 years. Beyond that was another in which the skulls and preserved heads of fallen enemies stared out from niches. Above, plates bearing their names and the date and place of death. Nowadays, the door to that room was kept locked out of deference to modern sensibilities. It was opened only to historians and anthropologists or during the clan initiations, the greeting of the ghosts. 3 nights ago, Jagu had been locked for 12 hours, all alone in that room. That was the trouble, thought Jagu, as he turned away and walked softly on 4 bare paws towards the dark anteroom. The ghosts, the Hero Fathers, had not greeted him. There had not been any. He could not tell his 4 parents that. It was impossible to acknowledge that his ancestors had scorned him, that they thought him unworthy of the name of Joma, man. Not that he thought that the heroes had scorned him. What does not exist cannot scorn. His parents did not know that. They had been elated because he had been one of the few to graduate from the Space Navy Academy of Vaagi. They were happy to put their eldest son through the long-awaited initiation into adulthood, but they had not been so happy when he said that he was not yet ready to choose a group mate from the eligible members of the clan. All 4 had pleaded with him, threatened him, stormed. He must get married before he left for the stars. He must ensure the perpetuation of their line. Leave many eggs in the hatchery before he assumed his duties as a spacer. Jagu had said no. Now he was sneaking out late at night, and he had run the gauntlet of the 12,000. But they were only squares of canvas or wood on which various colored oils had been arranged in different patterns. That was all. He paused by a tall wall mirror. The lights behind him shone gloomily in it. He looked like a ghost stepping out of the dark past towards himself, and where his 2 selves met. 6.5 feet tall he stood. His vertical torso was humanoid. At a distance, and in a dim light, If all but the forward breasts upwards had been hidden, he could have been mistaken for a human being, but his pinkish skin was hidden up to the neck with a golden pile of short, curling hairs. The head was very broad and round and massively boned. The cheekbones bulged like bosses on a shield. The jawbone was very thick. The deeply cleft chin was a prow. The latter was another sore point. His parents did not like it that he had shaved off the goatee. The nose was bulbous and covered with tiny, bristling blackish hairs. The supraorbital ridges flared out gothically. The eyes beneath were large, hazel, and rimmed with a half-inch wide circle of brown hair. The ears were shaped like a cat's, and the yellow hair on top of his head stood straight up. At the base of the spine of his upper torso was a device of bone, a natural universal joint that permitted the upper torso a 90-degree description forward. The lower torso was quadrupedal, as if he had only half evolved. The legs and paws were lion-shaped. His long tail was tufted at the end with black hair. Jagu had the normal vanity of a youth. He thought he was rather good-looking, and he did not mind examining himself. The string of diamonds hanging from around his neck was magnificent, as was also the gold plate at its end. On the plate was a design formed of diamonds in the shape of a lightning streak, his totem. Though he enjoyed the view, he could not stay there forever. He passed through a double-pointed arch into the anteroom. As he neared the door, he saw a big mound of fur rise and shake itself and slowly form into a six-legged animal with a long, bushy tail, a sharp, pointed nose, and great round scarlet ears. The rest of the Sigege was, except for the black nose and round black eyes, a chocolate brown. It rumbled in its massive chest. Then, recognizing Jagu with its nose, it whined a little and wagged its tail. Jagu patted it and said, "Go back to sleep, ah? I'm not taking you hunting tonight." The animal slumped into amorphous shagginess. Jagu pointed the key at the lock and pressed on the end. Just after dinner, he had deftly removed the key from its hook on the belt of Timo. Since another parent, Washagi, had locked the front door, Timo had not missed the key. Jagu regretted having to do this, though he did get a thrill out of being a successful pickpocket. But he saw no sense in the custom of refusing a youth his own key until he had become married. He wanted to go out late that night. If he could not get permission, he would go without it. The door swung open. He stepped quickly outside, and the door closed. 10 years ago, he would have had to bribe or sneak past the watcher of the door. Now, doormen were of the past. They could make more money working in the factories. The last of the family retainers had died some years ago. His place was taken by an electronic device. A full late-summer moon shone at zenith. It cast green-silver nets everywhere and caught shadows gaunt and grotesque. These were the towering diorite statues of the greatest heroes on the broad lawn, the 100-odd whose fighting fury had made the name of Wasiga famous. He did not pause to look at them, for he feared that an awe and dread left over from childhood might influence him. Instead, he looked upward, where a score of Joma-made satellites raced brightly across the night sky. He thought of the hundreds he could not see, of the Space Navy ships patrolling the reaches between the planets of the system, and of the few interstellar ships out there probing the galaxy. "What a contrast," he murmured. "On this earth, dumb stone sculptures rule the minds of a people who can go to the stars." He walked into a dark spot at the foot of the castle wall, an opening to a tunnel that led at a sharp slope downward. Formerly this area had been the moat. Then the moat was filled in. Later, the excavation was dug and lined with cement. At its end lay the underground garage. Here, Jago used the key to open the door again, and he entered. He did not hesitate, making a choice among the 6 vehicles. He wanted the long, slow, sleek Firebird. This was last year's model. 1 electric motor per wheel, 100 horsepower per motor, stick-controlled with a bubble top, holding 4 passengers. It was painted fiery red. Jago lifted the bubble top and stepped over the low side onto the floor. He squatted down behind the instrument panel, his rump against a thick cushion attached to a vertical steel plate. Then he pulled the bubble down. This was secured by magnetic clamps to the chassis. A separate and small motor provided the power for the electromagnets. He flicked a toggle switch, and the on indicator lit up. The big hydrogen tank was full. He pulled out the sliding panel with its 3 small sticks and pushed forward on one. Silently, the Firebird rolled forward and up the ramp. As its rear cleared the garage, Jago pressed a button and the iris of the garage door closed. The Firebird cruised down the driveway, past the stone ancestors, and then turned to the right onto the private highway. This led him winding through the forest of Wexa, scarlet pinoids, for about a mile. Only when he turned onto the public highway, which inclined downwards at this point, did he push the speed stick forward as far as it would go. The column of the velocity indicator, an instrument like a thermometer, showed 135 miles per hour, attained in 20 seconds. 2. He shot up and over the top of the hill and had to swerve violently to the left to pass a big cargo truck. But there were no approaching lights, and his horn, honking like a goose, answered the truck driver's furious blasts. He wished that these were the old days. Then, when an aristocrat wanted to travel without obstacle, he notified the police. They went ahead to clear the road. Now, to keep the ancient privilege in force would disrupt the heavy flow of commerce. Business came first, so he must take his chances like anyone else. He was not, like his ancestors, immune from arrest if he ran over someone or forced somebody off the road. He was even supposed to obey the speed laws. Usually he did, but tonight he did not feel like it. He passed a dozen other vehicles, several of them the old internal combustion type. After traveling for several miles, he slowed enough to turn onto another private road with some screeching of tires and fishtailing. He drove for a quarter of a mile, then stopped. Here he picked up Alaku. They gave each other a brief kiss. Alaku then jumped into the car beside Jago and braced his rump against the plate. The bubble closed. The car turned around and they sped away. Alaku unhooked a flask from his belt, unscrewed the top, and offered Jago a drink. Jago stuck his tongue out, signifying a negative reply, so Alaku tipped the bottle to his own lips. After gulping several times, he said, "My parents were after me again to know why I didn't pick a mate group. So I suggested that I marry you and Fawani and Tuugi. You should have heard the gasping, the choking, seen the red faces, the bristling tails, the flying fingers, and heard the words. I calmed them down somewhat by telling them that I was only joking, of course. Nevertheless, I had to hear a long and hot lecture on the degeneracy of modern youth, its flippancy, its near blasphemy, on how humor was a very good thing, but there were some things too sacred to joke about, and so on and on. If the lower classes wanted to forget about clan distinctions and marry just anybody, that was to be expected. What with increasing industrialization and urbanization, mass migrations, modern mobility, and so forth, the proletariat couldn't keep the clan lines straight. And it did not matter with them, but with us, Jorotama, the Aristoi, It mattered very much. Where would society, religion, government, etc. be if the great clans let everything slide into chaos? Especially if our clan, the Two-Fanged Eagles, set a bad example for the rest. You've heard the same thing. Jago sucked his breath inwards, sharply with assent, and said, "Yeah, a million times. Only I'm afraid I shocked my parents even more. Questioning marriage lines is bad enough, but to suggest that belief in ancestral ghosts just barely might, not be true, might be a hangover from the old superstitious days. Well, you've no idea of outraged parenthood until you've hinted at that. I had to undergo a ceremonial purification, an expensive one for the family and a tiring one for me. Also, I had to spend 4 hours locked up in a cell in the dungeon, and I had to listen to sermons and prayers piped into my cell. No way of turning the abominable stuff off. But the chanting did help me to sleep." "Poor Jagu," said Alaku, and he patted Jagu's arm. A few minutes later, they hurtled over a hilltop and saw, a mile away at the bottom of the long hill, twin beams of light from a car parked by the roadside. Jagu pulled up alongside the car. Two got out of it and walked into his Firebird, Fawani and Tuugi. Fawani of the Tree Lion clan and Tuugi of the Split-Tongue Dragons all gave each other a kiss. Then Jagu drove back to the highway and, in a short time, had it whistling at full speed. "Where are we meeting tonight?" said Tuugi. "I didn't get the message until late. Fawani phoned, but I had to make small talk and avoid saying anything about tonight. I think my parents are monitoring my calls. The dragons have always had a reputation for excessive suspiciousness. In this case, they've good reason to be, though I hope they don't know it." "We're going to the Seiki monument tonight," said Jagu. The others gasped. "You mean where the great battle was fought?" said Alaku. "Where our ancestors who fell in that battle are buried? Where the ghosts congregate every night and slay those who dare walk among them?" said Jagu. "But that's asking for it," said Fawani. "So we ask for it," said Jagu. "You don't really believe in all that tripe, or do you? If so, you'd better get out now. Go home, ask at once for a ritual cleansing. Take your beating. What we've done so far has been enough to stir up the ghosts, if any exist." There was silence for a moment. Then Fawani said, "Pass the bottle, Alaku. I'll drink to defiance to the ghosts and to our everlasting love." Jagu's laugh was hollow. He said, "A good toast, Fawani, but you'd better drink one to Wa'ati, the hero of speed. We're going to need his blessing, if he exists. Here comes a cop." The others turned to see what Jagu had detected in his rearview mirror. About a mile behind them, a yellow light was flashing off and on. Jagu flicked on a switch which brought in outside noises and turned the amplifier control. Now they could hear the barking of the highway patrolman's siren. "One more ticket, and my parents will take the Firebird away from me," said Jagu. "Hang on." He pressed a button. A light on the instrument panel lit up to indicate that shields were being lowered over the license plates. He took the Firebird around a passenger vehicle, his horn blaring, while the approaching beams of another grew larger and larger. Just before collision seemed imminent, while the others in his car had broken into terrified calls to the ghosts of their ancestors to save them, he whipped in front of the car just past. The cry of tires burning on the pavement came to them, and the gabble of the car they had just missed ramming keened away. His passengers said nothing. They were too frightened to protest. Besides, they knew that Jagu would pay no attention to them. He would kill them and himself rather than allow them to be caught. And actually it was better to die than be exposed to a public scandal. the recriminations of their parents, and the ritual cleansing. Jagu drove for half a mile and overtook a lumbering semi-trailer. He could not pass on the left, for a string of twin beams, too near, told him that he would have to wait. If he did, the patrolman would be on them, so he passed on the right, on the shoulder of the road, without slowing. Fortunately, the shoulder was comparatively smooth and wide, just wide enough for the Firebird. An inch away from the right wheels, the shoulder fell off and began to slope ever more towards the perpendicular. At the bottom of the hill was a creek, silvery in the moonlight. It ran along a heavily wooded slope. Alaku, looking out the bubble at the nearness of the hill, groaned. Then he lifted the bottle to his lips again. By the time he had taken a few deep swallows, Jagu had pulled around the truck. Fawami, looking behind him, saw the patrol car pull up behind the truck. Then one beam appeared as the car began to make the same maneuver as Jagu's. But it disappeared. The cop had changed his mind and swung in behind the truck. "He'll radio ahead," said Fawani. "Do you mean to crash a roadblock?" "If I have to," said Jagu cheerily. "But the entrance to the Seiki monument is only a half mile down the road. The cop will know where we turned in," said Alaku. Jagu switched off the lights, and they sped at 135 miles per hour along the moonlit highway. He began to slow after a few seconds, but they were still traveling at 60 miles per hour when he took the side road. For a moment, all were sure that they were going to overturn, all except Jagu. He had practiced making this turn at least 20 times, and he knew exactly what he could do. He skidded, but he brought the Firebird out of it just in time to keep the rear from sideswiping a large tree. Then he was back on the road and building up speed on the narrow, tree-lined pavement. This time he stopped accelerating at 90 miles per hour and drove for a half mile, taking the twists and turns with the ease of much practice and familiarity with this road. Suddenly he began slowing the car. In another half mile he had turned off the road and plunged into what looked to the others like a solid mass of trees. But there was a space between the trees, an aisle just wide enough for the Firebird to pass through without scraping the paint off the sides, and at the end of the dark aisle another which turned at a 45-degree angle. Jagu drove the car into the space there and turned off the power. They sat there, breathing heavily, looking off through the trees. From here they could not see the road itself, but they could see the flashing yellow of the patrol car as it sped down the road toward the Seiki monument. "Isn't there danger he'll see the others there?" said Fawani. "Not if they hid their cars like I told them to," said Jagu. He released the bubble, lifted it, and jumped out of the car. Raising the trunk cover in the rear of the car, he said, "Give me a hand. I've got something to fool him when he comes back looking for our tracks on the roadside." They climbed out and helped him lift a tightly rolled mass of green stuff. Under his orders, they carried it back to the point on the road at which they had turned off. After unrolling the stuff, they spread it out over the car tracks and smoothed it. When they were done, the area looked like smooth grass. There were even a few wildflowers, or what looked like wildflowers, sprouting up here and there among the grasses. Presently, from their hiding places behind trees, they saw the patrol car moving slowly back, its searchlight probing along the dirt and grass beside the pavement. It passed, and soon they could see its lights no more. Jagu gave the word, and they rolled the counterfeit grass into a tight bundle. Jagu had driven the car backward to the roadside while they were doing that. They placed the roll in the trunk, climbed back in, and Jagu drove off toward the monument. As they went along the twisting road, Fawani said, "If we hadn't been driving too fast, we could have avoided all this." "And missed a lot of fun," said Jagu. The rest of you still don't understand, said Alaku. Jagu doesn't care if we live or die. In fact, I sometimes think he'd just as soon die. Then his problems and ours would be over. Besides, he wants to make some sort of gesture at our parents and the society they represent, even if it's only outrunning a cop. Alaku's the cool, objective one, said Jagu. He sits to one side and dissects the situation and the people involved, but despite his often correct analysis, he never does anything about it. The eternal spectator. I'm not a leader, said Alaku somewhat coldly, but I can take as much action as the next person. So far I've participated quite fully. Have I ever failed to follow you? No, said Jagu. I apologize. I spoke from the back of my head. You know me, always too impulsive. No apology needed, said Alaku, his voice warming. 3. Then they were at the gateway to the Siikii monument. Jagu drove the car past it and under some trees across the road. Other vehicles were parked there. All 7 here, he said. They recrossed the road to a point about 40 yards south of the main gate. Jagu called softly. A voice replied softly, and a moment later a flexible plastic rope was thrown over the gate. Jagu was pulled up the 20-feet-high stone wall first, with much difficulty because of the leocentoroid construction of his body. On the other side he found Ponu of the Greentail Shrike clan waiting for him. They embraced. After the others had descended and the rope was pulled back over the wall, they walked softly toward the assignation point. The stone statues of their great and glorious ancestors stared down at them. These were dedicated to the fallen of the Battle of Siikii, the last major conflict of the last civil war of their nation. That had occurred 120 years before, and the ancestors of some of those assembled tonight had fought and slain each other then. It was this war that had killed off so many of the Aristoi that the lower classes had been able to demand certain rights and privileges denied them. It was also this war that had accelerated the growth of the fledgling industrial age. The youths walked past the frowning heroes and the pillars that marked various heroic exploits during the battle. All but Juga showed a restraint in the overwhelming presence of the heads. He chattered away in a low but confident voice. Before they had reached the center of the monument, the others were also talking and even laughing. Here, in the center, where the battle had been decided, was the most sacred of all sites in this area. Here was the colossal statue of Joma, the eponymous ancestor of the Joma species. The statue was carved out of a single mass of diorite and painted with colors that imitated those of the living Joma. It had no upper torso nor arms, only the head and neck attached to the quadrupedal body. The holy scriptures of the Joma, the Book of Mako, said that Joma had once been like his descendants, but in return for the power of sentience and for the privilege of seeing his young become the dominant species of this world and eventually of the universe, he had surrendered his arms, become like a crippled beast. Pleased by this sacrifice, Tu'u God had allowed Joma to reproduce parthenogenetically without the aid of the other 3 mates. Since Joma was the surviving member of his kind after Tu'u had, in a fit of righteous anger, killed most beings, Joma had no other partners. It was here that Jagu had decided to hold the love feast. He could not have picked a place more appropriate to show his contempt for the ghosts and for the beliefs that the entire population of the planet held sacred. Jagu and his friends greeted those waiting for them. Drinks were passed around along with jests. Ponu was that night's administrator. He had spread the carpets and placed the food and drinks on them. 8 carpets, and 4 joruma sat on each. As the night passed and the moon reached its zenith and began to sink, the talking and laughing became louder and thicker. Then Jagu took a large bottle from Ponu, unscrewed the cap, and went among the group. He gave each one a large pill from the bottle. Each swallowed it under his watchful eye. They made faces of repulsion, and Phawani almost threw his up, but he managed to keep it down when Jagu threatened to ram it down with his paw if Phawani didn't do the job himself. After that, Jagu made a mock prayer to Mako, a parody of the one that newly married quartets made to their particular household clan hero of fertility. He ended by taking a swig from a bottle of wine and then smashing the bottle against the face of Joma. An hour later, the first round of the love feast had been completed. The participants were resting, getting ready for the next round, and discussing the beauty and the minor disappointments of the last Congress. A whistle blew, shrilly. Jagu sprang to his feet. "The cops!" he said. "All right, everybody, don't panic. Get your headpieces and breastplates. Don't bother to put them on yet. Leave the carpets here. They haven't got any clan insignias on them. Follow me." The statue of Joma stood on a small hill in the center of the monument. It was this advantage in viewing that had determined Jagu's choice of site, in addition to his purpose in making the greatest blasphemy of all. He could see that the main gateway was open, and several cars with beams burning had just come through it. There were 3 other gates. All but one was also open, and cars coming through them. Probably, he thought, that gate had been left closed to lure them toward it. Once over it, they would find the police waiting for them beside the wall. But if this were a trap, then the police would have observed them hide their cars in the brush. That meant that even if he and his friends eluded the cops, they would all have a long walk home. A useless walk, because the police would have no trouble determining and finding the owners. There was a chance that this was not a prepared ambush. The patrolmen who had chased them might have been suspicious and brought back other police. They could have climbed the walls, seen the group under Joma, and decided to swoop in now. If so, it was also possible that they did not have enough personnel to come in through all the gates. The unguarded 4th gate could be an escape route. Almost he decided to make a run for the closed gate, but if he did so, and he was wrong, he would lead his friends to ruin. Whereas he had prepared some time ago a hiding place within the monument grounds itself. It would be foolish to take a chance on an unknown when he had something that was nearly 100% sure. "Follow me to Ngiiza," he said. "Run, but don't panic. If anyone falls or gets into difficulty, call out. We'll stop to help you." He began running. Behind him was the thud of paws and the harsh breathing of stress. They went down the hill on the side opposite the main gateway and toward the granite statue of the hero Ngiiza. Jagu looked around and noted that the other statues should hide them from the approaching policemen. He had chosen Ngiiza because there was a ring of statues around it, marking where Ngiiza had fallen inside a pile of his enemies' bodies. It took 60 seconds to get there from the center of the monument, plenty of time to open the trapdoor at the base of Ngiiza, and for all of them to crowd into the hole beneath. Over a year ago, Jagu and some of the others working on moonless or cloudy nights had dug out the hole. Then they had placed the beams which supported the trapdoor and put sod over it. The trapdoor was solid. He and 5 others had stood on it to test its weight and make sure that, on the days when crowds came to visit, the door would not betray its presence by bending. Now he and 3 others began rolling the sod back. The strip was narrow. It did not take long to do the job. Then, while he held the door up, the others jumped into the hole beneath and went to the back of the hole to make room for those following. By the time all except himself were in, the police cars had reached the center. Their searchlights began probing the monument. He had to drop down and lie motionless while several beams in turn sprayed the circle of statues. When they had passed, he leaped up. Alaku, below, held the trapdoor up just far enough for him to squeeze through. He had replaced the sod on top of it. This was the ticklish part of the whole procedure. No one could be left above to smooth the sod and make sure that the ragged edges did not show. But he did not think that the police could conceive of such a hiding place. When they started to make a search on Paw using their flashlights, they would expect to flush out the members of the party from behind individual statues. Their lights would play swiftly over the grass. They would be looking for youths lying flat on the grass, not for hidden trapdoors. It was hot and crowded in the hole. Jagu hoped they would not have to wait too long. Zotu had a mild case of claustrophobia. If he started to panic, he'd have to be knocked out for the good of everybody. The luminous face of his wristwatch showed 15:32. He'd give the cops an hour to search before deciding that the party had somehow gotten over the wall and away. After that, he would lead his friends out of the hole. If the police had not left somebody to watch the road, or if they did not make a determined search of the woods nearby and found the hidden cars, then all would go well. Many ifs, but it was exciting. A few minutes later, somebody stepped hard on the trapdoor. Jago suppressed a groan. If the cop heard the hollow sound, but that was unlikely. They should be shouting at each other. There was another rap, as if somebody were stomping his feet on the trapdoor. Then, while he held his breath and hoped the others would not cough or make any other noise, he heard something grate against wood. The next moment, the door swung up slowly. A harsh voice said, "All right, boys, the game's up. Come on out. Don't try anything. We'll shoot you." 4. Later, in the cell, when he had time to think, Jago wished that he had resisted. How much better to have been killed than to go through this. He was in a small cell and alone. He had been there for he did not know how long. There were no windows. His watch had been taken away, and he had no one to talk to. 3 meals were given to him through a little swinging door at the bottom of the large door. The tray was bolted to the door, and the food was placed in depressions. There was no cutlery. He had to eat with his fingers. 15 minutes after the tray swung inwards, it began to withdraw. No amount of tugging on his part could keep it from moving. The cell itself was furnished simply. The bed was bolted to the floor and without blankets or pillows. There was a wash bowl and an air blower with which to dry himself, and a hole in the floor to receive refuse. The walls were padded. He could not commit suicide if he wished to. Sometime after the 3rd meal, while he paced back and forth and wondered what punishment he would have to endure, what his companions were going through, what his parents knew and felt, the door opened. It did so silently. He was not aware of it until he turned to pace back toward it. 2 soldiers, not police, entered. Silently they escorted him out of the cell. Neither were armed, but he had the feeling that they knew all about the bare hand and paw fighting, that they were experienced, and that he would get badly hurt if he tried to attack them. He had no such intention. Not until he saw his way clear, anyway. As long as he was inside a building new to him, one that must be equipped with closed-circuit TV and electronic beams, he would be quiet. Meanwhile, he was taken down a long corridor and into an elevator. The elevator was some time rising, but he had no way of telling how many stories they had gone up. Then it stopped, and he was taken down another long hall, and then another. Finally they stopped before a door on which was incised, in the florid syllabary of a century ago, Tagimi Ti'ipa'aru'uzu'u, head of criminal detection. Arigi, the man responsible for detection and arrest of criminals of stature, conducted his business here. Jagu knew him, for Arigi had been among the elders present at his initiation. He was a fellow clansman. Though Jagu's knees shook, he swore he would show no fear. When he was marched in, he knew that he would have to remind himself constantly that he was not afraid. Arigi sat on his haunches behind a huge crescent-shaped desk of polished bini wood. He had a cold, hard face that was made even more unreadable by the dark glasses he wore. On his head was the four-cornered, tall-crowned hat of the high police. His arms were covered with bracelets, most of which had been awarded him by the government for various services. In his right hand was a stiletto with a jeweled handle. "It may interest you, fledgling," he said in a dry voice, pointing the stiletto at Jagu, "that you are the first of your fellows to be interviewed. The rest are still in their cells, wondering when the trial will commence. Tell me," he said so sharply that Jagu could not help flinching, "when did you first decide that the ghosts of your ancestors did not exist, except as a primitive superstition, figments in the minds of fools?" Jagu had decided not to deny any accusation that was true. If he were to suffer, so much the worse, but he would not degrade himself by lying or pleading. "I've always thought so," he said. "When I was a child, I may have believed in the existence of the spirits of my ancestors, but I do not remember it." "And you were intelligent enough not to proclaim this disbelief publicly," said Arigi. He seemed to relax a trifle, but Jagu was sure that Arigi was hoping he too would relax so that he could spring at him, catch him off guard. He wondered if his words were being recorded, his image being shown on a screen to his judges. He doubted that his trial for blasphemy would be made public. It would reflect too much discredit and dishonor on his clan, and they were powerful enough to suppress these things. Perhaps they might even have him in here merely to scare him, to make him repent. Then he would be let off with a reprimand, or, more likely, be assigned to a desk job, forever earthbound. But no, blasphemy was not merely a crime against the people of this planet. It was a spit in the face of his ancestors. Only pain and blood could wipe out that insult. The ghosts would crowd around him while he screamed over a fire and would lap at the blood flowing from his wounds. Arigi smiled as if he now had Jagu where he wanted him. He said, "Well, at least you're a cool one. You act as a Wazaga should. So far, anyway. Tell me, do all your friends also deny the existence of an afterlife?" "You will have to ask them that yourself." "You mean you do not know what they believe?" "I mean that I will not betray them." "But you betrayed them the moment you led them to the Seiki monument to defile the heroes with your illicit lovemaking and your blasphemous prayers," said Arigi. "You betrayed them the moment you first confided to them your doubts and encouraged them to express theirs. You betrayed them when you bought your unlawful contraceptive from criminals and fed it to your comrades before the orgy." Jagu stiffened. If no one had talked, how did Arigi know all this? Arigi smiled again, and he said, "You betrayed them more than you know. For instance, the Wi-Fi pill you gave them tonight had no potency at all. I had already ordered your source of supply to give you a pill that looked like and tasted like Wi-Fi, but it had no effect. A fourth of your friends must be pregnant right now, maybe you too." Jagu was shaken, but he tried to hide the effect of Aragi's words. He said, "If you've known about us for a long time, why didn't you arrest us before?" Aragi leaned his upper torso back and placed his fingers behind his head. He looked at a point above Jagu, as if his thoughts were there. He said slowly, and it seemed irrelevantly, "So far, we Joruma have discovered exactly 51 planets which can support our type of life. 51 out of an estimated 300,000 in this galaxy alone. Of the ones discovered, all found in the last 25 years, 12 were inhabited by a centauroid type of sentient similar to us, 5 by a bipedal type, 6 by very weird sentience indeed. All of these intelligent beings are bisexual, or I should say have a sexual bipolarity. None of them have our quadrupolar sexual makeup. If we extrapolate on what we have so far found, we could say that the centauroid type of body is that most favored by Tu'u, or if you prefer, the old pagan four parents of nature. The bipedal form is second, and Tu'u alone knows what other exotic beings are scattered throughout the cosmos. We could also speculate that Tu'u, for some reason, has favored us with a monopoly on the quadrupolar method of reproduction. At least we Joruma are the only ones encountered so far with that method. Now, what does that suggest to you?" 5. Jagu was puzzled. This inquisition was not going on the lines he had anticipated. He was not getting a thundering denunciation, a blistering lecture, threats of physical and mental punishment, of death. What was Aragi leading up to? Perhaps this line of conversation was intended to make him think that he was going to escape. Then Aragi would attack savagely when his defenses were lowered. The Book of Mako says that Ajoma is unique in this universe, that the Joruma are fashioned in the shape of Tu'u. No other creature in all the world, so said Mako, is favored of Tu'u. We're chosen by him to conquer the cosmos. So said Mako, replied Aragi, or whoever wrote the book, which is supposed to be written by Mako, but I want to know what you think. Now Jagu thought he knew what Aragi was trying to do to him. He was talking thus, leading him so he could get him to admit his disbelief. Then Aragi would spring. But why should Aragi bother? He had all the evidence. "What do I think?" said Jagu. "I think it rather strange that Tu'u should have made so many differing sentient beings. That is, those intelligent enough to have language and to have a word for God in their languages, but only make one in Tu'u's image. If he wanted all the planets to be eventually populated by the Joruma, why did he create other beings on these planets, all of whom, by the way, think they have been formed in their maker's image?" The two pairs of Aragi's eyelids had moved inwards so that only a sliver of pale green showed between them. He said, "You know that what you have said is enough to condemn you? That if I submit the evidence to the judges, you could be slowly burned alive. It's true that most blasphemers are killed quickly by being thrown into an intense furnace, but the law still stands. I would be within legal rights if I had you toasted so slowly that it would take you 12 hours or more to die." "I know," said Jagu. "I had my fun with my friends. I spat at the ghosts. Now I have to pay." Again, Aragi seemed to start talking without relevance to the issue. "Before Mako died, he said that his ghost would go forth through the cosmos, and he would place on other worlds a sign that the world was to be the possession of the Joruma. Now, this took place 2,500 years before space travel. Such a thing was not even dreamed of in his time. Yet, when we reached the first inhabitable world, we found the sign he promised to leave behind him, the stone statue of Joma, our ancestor. It was carved by Mako to show that he had been there and had staked out this world for the faithful, for the Jaruma, and 5 others of the 55 so far found have thereon a giant stone statue of Joma. Tell me, how do you account for that? Jago said slowly, either Mako's ghost carved the image of Joma out of the native stone, or... He paused. Or what? Jago opened his mouth, but the words came hard. He swallowed and forced them out. Or our spacemen carved those statues themselves? He said. Aragi's reaction was not what Jago had expected. Aragi laughed loudly until his face was red. Finally, wheezing, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief, he said, So, you guessed it. I wonder how many others have, and like you are keeping silent because of fear? He blew his nose and then continued. Not many, I suppose. There are not too many born skeptics such as yourself, or many as intelligent. He looked curiously at Jago. You aren't happy to find yourself right? What's the matter? I don't know. Maybe, though I disbelieved, I'd always hoped that my faith could be reestablished. How much easier for me if it could be, if our spaceships had found the statues of Mako waiting for them. I'd have no choice but to believe. No, you wouldn't, said Aragi sharply. Jago stared. I wouldn't? No. If all the evidence pointed toward the reality of Mako as a ghost, if the evidence were overwhelming, you still would not have believed. You would have found some rationalization for your disbelief. You would have said that the correct explanation or interpretation just wasn't available, and you would have continued to reject the idea of the ghost. Why? Said Jago. I'm a reasonable person. I'm rational. I think scientifically. Oh, sure, said Aragi. But you were born an agnostic, a skeptic. You had the temperament of the disbeliever in the womb. Only by a violent perversion of your innate character could you have accepted religion. Most people are born believers. Some are not. It's that simple. You mean, said Jago, that reality doesn't have a thing to do with it? That I think as I do not because I have reasoned my way through the dark labyrinth of religion, but because my temperament made me think so? That's an accurate statement. But, said Jago, what you're saying is that there is no truth, that the most ignorant peasant and fervent believer of ghosts has as much basis to his claims as I have to mine. Truth? There are truths and truths. You fall off a high cliff and you accelerate at such and such a velocity until you hit the ground. Water, if not dammed, flows downward. These are truths no one argues about. Temperament does not matter in physical matters, but in the realm of metaphysics, truth is an affair of natal prejudice. That is all. Jago had not been shaken by the thought of the fire and the death that waited for him. Now he was trembling and outraged. Later he would be depressed. Aragi's cynicism made his look like a child's. Aragi said, The enlightened members, the born skeptics of the Aristoi have not believed in the existence of ghosts for some time. In a land crowded with the granite images of their illustrious ancestors and crowded with worshippers of these sculptured stones. We laugh, but silently, or only among ourselves. Many of us even doubt the existence of God. But we aren't fools. We suppress any show of public skepticism. After all, the fabric of our society is woven from the threads of our religion. It's an excellent means for keeping the people in line or for justifying our rule over them. Now, haven't you detected a certain pattern in the finding of the statues of Mako on the interstellar planes, in the particular type of planet on which the statues are? Jago spoke slowly to control the shakiness of his voice. The images are not found on those planets populated by sentience technologically equal to us, only on those planets with no sentience or with sentience having an inferior technology. Very good, said Aragi. You can see that is no coincidence. We aren't about to wage war on beings who are able to retaliate effectively. Not yet, anyway. Now I'll tell you why I revealed this to you, rather confirmed your suspicions. Ever since we have had a faster-than-light drive, our interstellar exploratory ships have been manned with crews of a certain type. All are aristocrats, and all are disbelievers. They have had no compunction about chiseling statues out of the native rock on the appropriate planets. Why do they have to do this? Said Jago. To establish a principle, to justify us. Someday another sentient of equal, maybe superior, technological development will try to claim one of our planets for its own. When that day comes, we want our warriors and the people at home to be fired with a religious frenzy. You want me and my comrades to do this work for you? For yourselves, too, said Aragi. You young ones will have to take the reins of government after we're dead. And there's another factor. We're recruiting you because we need replacements. This is dangerous work. Every now and then a ship is lost, just lost, leaves port and is never heard of again. We need new interstellar spacers. We need you and your friends now. What do you say? Is there a choice? Asked Jago. If we turn down your offer, what happens to us? An accident, said Aragi. We can't have a trial and execution, not even in secret. Too much chance of dishonoring ancient and honorable clans. Very well, I accept. I can't speak for my friends, but I'll speak to them. I'm sure they'll see the light, said Aragi dryly. 6. A few days later, Jago flew to the school for advanced Space Navy officers. He and his friends began to take numerous training tips on ships that operated within the confines of the solar system. A year passed, and then they made 3 trips to nearby planetary systems under the tutelage of veterans. On the final voyage and the combat exercises that went with it, the veterans acted only as observers. There was another ceremony. A new interstellar destroyer was commissioned and christened the Pa'aja, and Jago was given a captain's red stone to wear on the brim of his hat. The rest of the group also got various insignias of lesser ranks, for the craft was to be manned entirely by them. Before leaving on the maiden voyage of the Pa'aja, Jago was summoned for one more interview with Aragi. By now, Jago knew that Aragi held more power than the public guessed. He was not only head of the planetary police system, he also was responsible for all military security systems. Aragi welcomed Jago as a member of the inner circle. He asked him to sit down and give him a glass of kusuto. It was vintage of the best, 30 years old. You have added honor and luster to our clan, said Aragi. The Wazaga can be proud of you. You were not given the captainship merely because you are a Wazaga, you know. A stellar ship is too expensive and important to be entrusted to a youth whose main ability is affiliation with a ruling group. You are a captain because you deserve the rank. He sniffed at the bouquet of the wine and took a small sip. Then he put the glass down, squinted at Jagu, and said, "In a few days you will receive official orders to make your first exploratory voyage. Your ship will have enough fuel and supplies for a 4-year trip, but you will be ordered to return at the end of 2.5, circumstances permitting. During that 1.25 year, you will try to locate inhabitable planets. If any planet has sentience with a technology with space travel restricted to its system and atomic power, you will note its present development and its potential resistance to future attack by us. If the sentients have interstellar travel, you will observe as much as possible, but you will not place your ship in danger of attack, and you will return after making the observations, directly and at full speed to us. If the sentients have an inferior technology, you will locate a site easily observable from orbit and will erect or carve an image of Mako there. Now, by the time you will have returned, many more eggs will have been hatched here. There will be a larger proportion of natal disbelievers among them than in the few years previously. By the time you are my age, the number of disbelievers will be a great problem. There will be strife, changing mores, doubt, perhaps even bloodshed. Before this occurs, before the change of zeitgeist is on the side of the disbelievers, and the faith in the heroes and in Mako declines, we will have settled colonies on various planets uninhabited by sentients. We will also have wiped out or reduced greatly in number those sentients inferior to us. We will have started populating these with our kind. Because of our method of reproduction, we can populate a planet faster than any other sentient, and that is well, since we will need these colonies to aid us in the wars that will come. It is inevitable that we will have to fight cultures equal or perhaps even superior to ours. When that comes, we will have established the pattern that we have a spiritual right to take anything we want. By then, the weakened belief in the religion of our fathers will not affect our fighting zeal. We will be replacing it with another belief, our right to conquest. Meanwhile, of course, I will be doing my best to suppress any resistance to our official religion. Those infidels among the Aristoi will be indoctrinated in the proper attitude, a conscious hypocrisy. Those who nobly refuse will be dealt with in one way or another. The disbelievers among the lower classes will also be eliminated. They will be branded as criminals. But of course they can only fight the zeitgeist so long. Then it takes over. By that time I will have joined my ancestors, and my work will be done." He smiled wryly and said, "I will be a ghost, perhaps with a statue erected to me. However, by then my descendants, except for the inevitable ultra-reactionaries, will regard my shrine as a historical or anthropological curiosity. I will have to go hungry among the other hungry ghosts, unhonored, unfed, wailing with weakness and impotent anger." Jagu wondered if Aragi did not more than half mean those words. He also wondered if Aragi was not as self-deceiving as those he laughed at. He was making his own personal mythology to replace the old. After all, what evidence did he really have to support his thesis that believers were born, not made? A week later, he was on the Pa'aja and had given the order to take it off. Another week, and his natal star was only one among many, a tiny glow. He was headed for the far off and the unknown. A year later, 30 stars later, they found two inhabitable planets. The second, like the first, rotated around a star of the AOU type. Unlike the first, it was the third planet from the star, and it had sentience. The Pa'aja went into orbit in the upper atmosphere, and the telescopes were turned on the surface. The powers of magnification of the telescopes were so great that the spacers could see as distinctly as if they had been poised only 20 feet above the ground. The sentients were bipedal and comparatively hairless, except for thick growths on their heads, or, among the males, on the faces. The majority covered their bodies with a variety of garments. Like the Jaruma, their skin colors and their hair types varied. The darker ones were mainly in the equatorial zone. Thousands of photographs were made during the orbitings of the Pa'aja. Those taken of the groups that were little or no clothing made it evident that these bipedals had only two sexes. Another fact was determined. These sentients had no technology to be compared to the Jarumas. They did not even have aircraft, except for a few balloons. Their main propulsive power was the steam engine. Steam drove engines of iron on iron tracks and paddle wheels or screws on ships. There were many sail ships also. The most formidable weapons were cannons and simple breech-loading rifles. The Aborigines were roughly at about the same stage the Jaruma had been about a century and a half ago. 7. On their 300th orbit, Alaku made a shattering discovery. He was looking at the scene projected on a large screen by a telescope when he cried out loudly. Those nearby came running, and they stopped when they saw what he was staring at. They too cried out. By the time Jagu arrived, the scene was out of the telescope's reach. But he listened to their descriptions, and he ordered that the photos made be brought to him at once. He looked at the photos, and he said, keeping his face immobile so that the others could not understand how shocked he was, "We'll have to go down and see for ourselves." 4 of them went down on the launch while the ship, in stationary orbit, stayed overhead. Their destination was on a rocky plateau about 5 miles southeast of the nearest city. The city was on the west bank of a great river that created a ribbon of greenery in the middle of the desert that covered much of the northern half of the continent. It was night, but a full moon shone in a cloudless sky. It illuminated brightly the 3 huge pyramids of stone and the object that had upset the crew of the Pa'aja so much. This lay in the center of a large quarry. After hiding their ship in a deep and narrow ravine, the 4 proceeded in a small half-track. A minute later, Jagu halted it, and all got out to look. There was silence for a while. Then Jagu, speaking slowly as if hesitant to commit himself, said, "It seems to be Joma." "It's ancient," said Alaku. "Very ancient. If Mako made this, he must have done so immediately after dying. He must have come straight here." "Don't jump to conclusions," said Jagu. "I was going to say that another ship had gotten here before us, but we know no ship has been sent to this sector." However what?" said Alaku. "Well, as you said, it's ancient. Look at the ripples in the stone. They must have been made by erosion from blowing sand. Look at the face. It's shattered. Still, the natives of long ago could have made this. It's very possible." Silent again, they re-entered the half-track and began to drive slowly around the enormous statue. "It faces the east," said Alaku. "Just as Mako said the statues of Joma would." Many primitive sentients on many worlds face their gods, their temples, and their dead towards the east, said Jagu. It's natural to regard the rising sun as the recurrent symbol of immortality. Fawani said, This may be the biggest reproduction of Joma, but it's not the only one on this world. The photos showed others. They too must be ancient. Perhaps it's only coincidence. The natives themselves made them. They're figures, symbols of their religion. Or, said Alaku, the natives founded a religion that was based on Joma after Mako came here and carved this statue out of the rock. He may even have given them our religion. So, as you saw, they set up a temple before Joma. I'm sure that's what the ruins in front of the breasts were. They made other smaller images of Joma. Then, ages later, they ceased to believe in Joma, just as we are ceasing to believe. Yet the testimony to the truth was before their mocking eyes. Jagu knew they could not determine the truth, no matter how long they speculated among themselves. The thing to do was to locate somebody who did know. He turned the half-track towards the city. There were isolated houses on its outskirts. Before he had gone a mile, he found what he was looking for. A party of natives were headed towards him. All were riding beasts that looked very much like the gapo of the deserts of his own planet, except that these had only 4 legs and 1 hump. The gapoids scattered in a panic. Some threw their riders. The Jaruma shot these with gas-driven darts, the tips of which were coated with a paralyzing drug. After tearing the robes from his victims to make sure he had a specimen of each sex, for he knew that the zoologists at home would want to examine them, the Jaruma chose a male and a female. These were loaded into the half-track, which then returned to the launch. In a few minutes, the launch was rising towards the Pa'aja. Back on the ship, the sleepers were placed on beds within a locked room. Jagu inspected them and, for the 1000th time, wondered if the Jaruma were not designed by Tu'u to be superior. Perhaps they were really made in Tu'u's image. These bipedals seemed to be so scrawny and weak and so inefficient, sexually speaking. One sex could never hatch an egg or bear young. This fault halved the species' chances of reproducing. Moreover, he thought, preserving humor even in his semi-stunned condition, it cut out 3/4 of the fun. Maybe the other sentients were, as some theologians had theorized, experiments on Tu'u's part, or maybe Tu'u had meant for non-Jaruma to be inferior. Let the theologians speculate. He had a far more important and immediate enigma to solve. Also, he had Alaku to worry about. Alaku, the cool one, he whose only permanent passion was intellectualism, the agnostic, was by far the most shaken. Jagu remembered Aragi's words. You believe what you want to believe. The metaphysical cannot be denied or affirmed in terms of the physical. It's a judgment, said Alaku. We thought we were so clever and our fathers so ignorant and superstitious, but Mako knew that someday we would come here and find the truth. He knew it before our great-great-great-great-grandfathers were born. We have 2 natives, said Jagu. We'll learn their language. From them, we may discover who did carve out Joma. I mean, that statue that seems to resemble Joma. How will they know? Said Alaku, looking desperate. They will have only the words of their ancestors as testimony, just as we have the words of ours. This was the last time Jagu talked to Alaku. Shortly thereafter, Alaku failed to appear for his turn of duty on the bridge. Jagu called him over the intercom. Receiving no answer, he went to Alaku's cabin. The door was locked, but it yielded to the master key. Alaku lay on the floor, his skin blue from cyanide. He left no note behind. None was needed. The entire crew was saddened and depressed. Alaku, despite a certain aloofness, had been loved. The many eggs he had fathered in them, and the eggs they had fathered in him, were in the cryogenic tank, waiting to be quick-thawed when they returned to their home. A few hours later, the two natives killed each other. The bigger one strangled the other, but before that the veins of the strangler's wrists had been bitten into and opened by the other. After the smaller had died, the other had exercised violently to stimulate the bleeding. Almost, Jagu decided to turn around and capture some more sentience from the same area, but he could not force himself to do that. To return and see Joma again, the awe-inspiring ancient being of stone, who knew but what more might go mad? He could be among them. For several ship days he paced back and forth on the bridge, or he lay in his bed in his cabin, staring at the bulkhead. Finally, one third watch, Jagu went onto the bridge. Fawani, the closest of all to him, was also on the bridge, carrying out his slight duties as pilot. He did not seem surprised to see Jagu. Jagu often came here when he was supposed to be sleeping. "It has been a long time since we were together," said Fawani. "The statue on that Tu'u forsaken planet and Alaku's suicide, they have killed love. They have killed everything except wonder about one question." "I don't wonder. I know that it was made by the natives. I know because that's the only way it could be. But there's no way of proving it, is there?" said Fawani. "No," replied Jagu. "So before we get back home, long before, we must make up our minds to act." "What do you mean?" "We have several avenues of action. One, report exactly what we've seen. Let the authorities do the thinking for us. Let them decide what to do. 2, forget about having discovered the second planet. Report only the first planet. 3, don't go home. Find a planet suitable for colonization, one so far away it may not be found by other Joruma ships for hundreds of years, maybe longer. All 3 are dangerous," continued Jagu. "You don't know Aragi as I do. He will refuse to believe in the coincidence because the mathematical chances against it are too high. He will also refuse to believe that Mako did it. He will conclude that we made those statues to perpetrate a monstrous hoax. But how could he believe such a thing?" "I couldn't blame him," said Jagu, "because he knows our past record. He might think that we did it just to raise hell, or even that the long voyage unbalanced us, that we became converted, backslid to superstition, committed a pious fraud to convince him and others like him. It doesn't matter. He'll think we did it. He has to think that, or admit his whole philosophy of life is wrong. If we try to get rid of all evidence, the photos, the logbook, we run a risk of someone talking. I think it'd be a certainty. We belong to the species that can't keep its mouth shut, or somebody else may go mad and babble the truth. Personally, I think that we should try the third alternative. Go far out into an unknown sector, so far that we can't return. This will put us beyond the range of any ships now built. If in the future one should find us, we can always say we had an accident, that the ship couldn't return." "But what if we reach the end of our fuel and we still have found no suitable planet?" said Fawami. "It's a long chance, but the best we have," said Jagu. He pointed at the lower left-hand corner of a star map on a bulkhead. "There are quite a few AOU stars there," he said. "If I gave the order to you now, at this moment, to head the ship toward them. Would you obey my order?" "I don't know what to think," said Fawani. "I do know that we could spend the rest of our long voyage home arguing about the best course of action, and still be undecided by the time we let down on Earth. I trust you, Jagu, because I believe in you." "Believe?" said Jagu. He smiled. "Are there also born believers in others? And those men born to be believed in? Perhaps, but what about the rest of the crew? Will they as unhesitatingly follow me?" "Talk to them," said Fawani. "Tell them what you told me. They will do as I did. I won't even wait for the outcome. I'll turn the ship now. They won't need to know that until after they've decided to do so, provided you talk to them before I'm relieved." "Very well. Turn it around. Head it in that general direction. We'll pick out a particular star later. We'll find one or die trying. We'll begin life anew. And we don't teach our children anything about the ghosts of long-dead heroes." "Turnabout it is," said Fawani. He busied himself with the controls and with inserting various cards in the computer. Then he said, "But can man exist in a religious vacuum? What will we tell them to replace the old beliefs? They'll believe what they want to believe," said Jagu wearily. "Anyway, we've a long time to think about that." He was silent while he looked out at the stars. He thought about the planet they had just left. The sentients there would never know what gratitude they owed to him, Jagu. If he had returned to base and told his story, the Navy, no matter what happened to Jagu and his crew, would go to that planet, and they would proceed to capture specimens and would determine their reaction to a number of laboratory-created diseases. Within a few years only, the naturally resistant of the natives would be left alive. Their planet would be open to colonization by the Jaruma. Now the bipedals had a period of grace. If they developed space travel and atomic power soon enough, the next Jaruma ship would declare them off limits. Who knew? His own descendants might regret this decision. Someday, the sons of those sentients who had been spared by his action might come to the very planet on which his, Jagu's, sons would be living. They might even attack and destroy or enslave the Jaruma. That was another chance he and his descendants would have to take. He pressed the button that would awaken the sleepers and summon those on watch. Now he must begin talking. He knew that they all would be troubled until the day they died. Yet he swore to himself their sons would not know of it. They would be free of the past and its doubts and its fears. They would be free.